Hello, friends. Tonight, we travel back more than 1,000 years to the lands that today stretch across Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and parts of Lithuania. Back then, this region was known as Kyivan Rus, a loose network of tribes and principalities, united more by trade and kinship than by a single government. Do you think Kyivan Rus is Ukraine or Russia? Write about it in the comments. It was the late 10th century. The Dnipro River, which still flows today through modern Ukraine, was the lifeline of the realm. It connected the northern forests near Novgorod, now part of Russia, with the Black Sea and the riches of Byzantium, located in what is now Istanbul, Turkey. Along its steep banks rose the wooden city of Kyiv, the heart of Kyivan Rus and the capital of a growing realm. If you stand on Kyiv's hills today, you might still see the winding river beneath you, just as the people of that time saw it. Back then, the city smelled of pinewood smoke, wet earth, and fresh grain brought by traders from distant lands. But this was a time before Christian bells rang over Kyiv's hills. Here, people still prayed to pagan gods and believed that nature itself was alive with divine power. The supreme deity was Perun, god of thunder and war, whose wooden idol once stood on a hill in Kyiv, the same hill where St. Andrew's Church stands today in modern Ukraine. Warriors carried Perun's symbol into battle, hoping his lightning would strike their enemies. Veles, god of cattle, wealth, and the underworld, was honored by merchants and farmers alike. Today, some historians believe that his cult stretched deep into the forests of what is now Belarus and western Russia, where cattle herding was central to survival. Mokosh, goddess of fertility and women's fate, was worshipped widely across the lands that now belong to Ukraine and Lithuania. Her sacred symbols have been found in burial sites near modern Vilnius and Chernihiv, two cities now in different countries but once part of the same cultural world. Every river, every tree, every stone carried a spirit. Villagers whispered prayers to protect their homes, their crops, and their families. And across these lands, from Kyiv to Smolensk, today in Russia, and from Chernihiv, now Ukraine, to Polotsk, now Belarus, people lived under the same sky, sharing rituals that had survived for generations. Life was simple, but it was never easy. Winters were long and brutal, especially in the northern forests near what is now Novgorod, Russia. Summers were short and precious, filled with farming, fishing, and trading. Along the Dnipro, communities relied on hunting, agriculture, and river trade, sending honey, wax, furs, and grain to Byzantium in exchange for silks, wines, and silver coins. These ancient trade routes, known as from the Varangians to the Greeks, linked the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea. If you look at a modern map, they cut across Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. For the people of the 10th century, these rivers were highways of wealth and danger, bringing not only riches but also invaders. Foreign merchants filled Kyiv's markets. Greeks from Byzantium with fine jewelry, wines, and icons. Arabs from Baghdad and Khwarezm with silver, spices, and medicines. Scandinavian Varangians from what is now Sweden and Norway, selling weapons, amber, and furs. In these crowded markets, one could hear many languages: Old Norse, Greek, Arabic, early Slavic dialects, and even Latin. Kyivan Rus was vast, stretching from the forests near modern St. Petersburg, Russia, to the grasslands of southern Ukraine, and from the rivers of Belarus to the edges of the Baltic states. But it was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of tribes. Polans in central Ukraine, Drevlians near modern Zhytomyr, Severians near modern Chernihiv, Kriviches in today's Belarus, and Vyatikai in modern Russia. Each tribe had its customs, its rituals, its leaders. Yet all were slowly drawn toward Kyiv's growing influence. By the 10th century, Kyiv had become the political and cultural heart of a realm that spanned 4 modern countries. And yet, even as sacred fires burned in pagan groves, winds of transformation blew across the land. From the south came Byzantine missionaries, speaking of one God and eternal salvation. From the west, Latin priests arrived from what is now Poland and Germany, carrying letters from Rome. From the east, Islamic traders from the lands of the Volga Bulgars and modern Tatarstan, Russia, spoke of the Prophet and the unity of the faithful. Kyiv, located in modern Ukraine, stood at the crossroads of empires, faiths, and cultures. Wooden idols still looked over the city, but in its streets walked Greek scholars, Arab traders, and Varangian mercenaries. The people of Rus were living at the edge of two worlds, one ancient, one new. And deep within the halls of Kyiv's princely palace, a young ruler listened. Prince Volodymyr, son of Sviatoslav the Brave, had inherited a realm divided by bloodlines, faiths, and ambitions. For now, he still knelt before pagan gods. But he could not ignore the whispers carried by merchants and envoys. Soon, Volodymyr would face a choice that would change history. A choice that would shape the identities of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus for centuries to come. But on this quiet night, Kyivan Rus remained as it had been for generations. Sacred fires lit the hills of modern Kyiv. Shamans in forests of today's Belarus whispered prayers to hidden spirits. Traders in Novgorod, now Russia, loaded their boats for long journeys south. The world was still pagan, but history was already moving. The year was 972 AD. The lands of Kyivan Rus, stretching across what is now Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and parts of Lithuania, were vast, but fragile. The death of Prince Sviatoslav the Brave, a warrior feared from the Caspian Sea to the Balkans, left behind not peace, but chaos. 3 sons survived him, Yerepok, Ola, and the youngest, Volodymyr. Each claimed the right to rule. The capital, Kyiv, today's capital of Ukraine, was the greatest prize of all. Whoever held Kyiv controlled the trade routes, the tribute, and the loyalty of dozens of tribes. But in these turbulent years, loyalty shifted like river currents. At Sviatoslav's death, his 3 sons divided the realm. Yerepok ruled from Kyiv, commanding the heartlands along the Dnipro River, modern central Ukraine. Ola controlled the Drevlians near today's Zhytomyr and western Ukraine, a proud tribe known for resisting outsiders. Volodymyr, the youngest, ruled Novgorod, a vital northern center near modern St. Petersburg, Russia. But Kyivan Rus was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of alliances. Each prince relied on the loyalty of local tribes: Polans, Drevlians, Severians, Kriviches, Vyatakai, scattered across lands that today span Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and Lithuania. The balance was delicate, and a single betrayal could plunge the entire realm into war. Volodymyr, still young and untested, ruled Novgorod from wooden halls overlooking the Mokosh River. But far to the south, Yerepok in Kyiv plotted against his brothers. Tensions escalated when a violent conflict erupted between Yerepok and Ola over Drevlian lands. Historical chronicles tell us that Yerepok's forces ambushed Ola's men near modern Zhytomyr, Ukraine. Ola was killed, his warriors scattered. With Ola's death, Yerepok seized his lands, gaining control over much of western Ukraine. Volodymyr, fearing that Yerepok would soon march north, fled Novgorod. He escaped across the Baltic Sea to Scandinavia, likely modern Sweden, seeking refuge among his Varangian kinsmen, Norse warriors who often served as mercenaries in Kyivan Rus. For 2 years, Novgorod fell under Yerepok's control. But Volodymyr was not idle. Far from home, he gathered an army of hardened Varangian warriors, men who lived by the sword and sailed their longships across seas and rivers. In 978 AD, he returned to reclaim his throne. The campaign began in the north. Volodymyr's Varangian fleet sailed down rivers that today cut through Estonia, Latvia, and northern Russia. One by one, the northern towns swore loyalty to him again. Soon, he stood before the gates of Novgorod and retook his ancestral seat without bloodshed. But Volodymyr's ambition reached far beyond Novgorod. His goal was Kyiv. He marched south through the lands of the Kriviches in modern Belarus, gathering warriors as he went. Crossing forests and rivers, his forces swelled with Severians near modern Chernihiv, Ukraine, and even some Vyatakai from what is now central Russia. By the time Volodymyr reached the Dnipro River, his army was vast. A mix of Slavic warriors, Varangian mercenaries, and tribal allies, a force unlike any Kyiv had seen in years. In 980 AD, Volodymyr finally laid siege to Kyiv. The city, protected by tall wooden walls and steep hills, was a fortress. Inside, Yerepok waited, relying on his experienced commanders and the loyalty of Kyiv's boyars. But Volodymyr used cunning, not brute force. He sent envoys into the city, offering safety to those who surrendered and promising generous rewards. Slowly, Yerepok's allies abandoned him, opening the gates to Volodymyr's forces. Historical accounts differ on Yerepok's fate. Some say he was betrayed by his own men and killed in an ambush. Others claim Volodymyr ordered his death to secure his rule. What is certain is this: by the end of 980 AD, Volodymyr entered Kyiv as its undisputed ruler. Volodymyr, now Prince of Kyiv, stood atop the great hill where today rises the St. Sophia Cathedral. But in his time, the hill was crowned by pagan idols, wooden statues of Perun, Veles, Mokosh, and other gods. Volodymyr restored and expanded these shrines, declaring Perun the chief deity of Kyivan Rus. Under his rule, sacrifices increased, rituals grew larger, and sacred fires burned day and night. This was a time when pagan faith reached its peak, and yet whispers of other religions were growing louder. Merchants brought tales from Byzantium, Rome, and lands far to the east. Envoys spoke of one God, eternal salvation, and powerful alliances with foreign rulers. Volodymyr listened, but for now he remained loyal to the gods of his ancestors. Still, deep inside the wooden halls of his palace, the young prince knew that pagan traditions alone could not hold his realm together. Kyivan Rus was vast, diverse, and divided by faiths, cultures, and ambitions. And soon, the question of religion would decide its destiny. The year was 981 AD. The great city of Kyiv, perched on its high hills above the Dnipro River, in what is now Ukraine, stood at the height of its pagan glory. Sacred fires burned day and night. Wooden statues of Perun, Veles, Mokosh, and Dazbog overlooked the city from the hill where today rises the St. Sophia Cathedral. The chants of pagan priests mixed with the sounds of markets and forges, echoing through wooden streets lined with smoke and pine resin. Prince Volodymyr the Great, now the undisputed ruler of Kyivan Rus, had rebuilt his capital into a fortress of wood and faith. The realm stretched farther than ever before, from the forests near modern St. Petersburg, Russia, to the steppes of southern Ukraine, and from the rivers of Belarus to the Baltic shores of Latvia and Lithuania. Yet despite his victories, the realm was fragile. Kyivan Rus was vast, but it was not a single nation. It was a tapestry of peoples and faiths, bound together by trade and allegiance, but divided by customs, languages, and gods. Volodymyr, now a powerful ruler, strengthened the old Slavic religion. He rebuilt pagan sanctuaries across Kyivan Rus, erecting new wooden idols, larger and more elaborate than ever before. The hill of Kyiv became a sacred place where rituals lasted for days, and sacrifices to Perun were performed before every military campaign. Priests claimed the gods favored Kyivan Rus. Harvests were bountiful. Trade along the Dnipro flourished. Neighboring tribes swore loyalty, fearing Volodymyr's warriors. But beneath this strength lay deep divisions. Not all tribes shared the same gods. The Kriviches in modern Belarus honored Veles above Perun. The Vyatikai in today's Russia worshipped their own spirits and forest deities. And in the south, near Chersonesus, modern Crimea, Ukraine, Byzantine missionaries whispered of a single eternal God, sowing seeds of doubt. Kyiv stood at the crossroads of worlds, and worlds were beginning to converge. From the south, across the Black Sea, came Byzantine missionaries from what is now Istanbul, Turkey. They carried golden crosses, icons of saints, and scrolls of scripture. They spoke of one God, eternal salvation, and the might of the Byzantine Empire. From the west, Latin priests arrived from the lands of modern Poland and Germany, carrying letters sealed by the Pope of Rome. They offered not only faith but alliances with powerful kingdoms of the West. From the east, Islamic merchants from Volga, Bulgaria, and modern Tatarstan, Russia, came with silk, silver, and spices. They spoke of the Prophet and the unity of the faithful, presenting Islam as both a faith and a powerful social order. And from the north, Varangian traders, Norse warriors, and merchants from Sweden continued to bring their own gods and sagas, living side by side with Slavic villagers along the great rivers. Volodymyr, once a devout pagan, now found himself surrounded by choices. Each faith came not only with spiritual promises but also with political consequences. Kyivan Rus was too large and too diverse to remain stable without a common foundation. Volodymyr knew that to secure his realm, he needed more than armies and trade. He needed something deeper, a shared identity. Religion was the heart of this challenge. Every tribe had its rituals, its songs, its gods. Festivals that united one region alienated another. A single faith could unify his realm, but choosing wrong could divide it forever. Volodymyr spent long nights in the wooden halls of his palace, built where today stands the national sanctuary of Saint Sophia in Kyiv. Candles burned low as envoys brought reports. Tales of Byzantine wealth and splendor. Warnings of Latin influence spreading from the west. News of Islamic power growing along the Volga and the Caspian. Kyiv was becoming the stage for a spiritual competition that stretched across continents. Volodymyr summoned his boyars and advisors to discuss the matter. Some urged him to embrace Byzantium, the empire of majestic cathedrals, imperial alliances, and military strength. Others favored Rome, believing ties with the Pope would open doors to Western Europe's wealth and knowledge. A few whispered about Islam, drawn to the prosperity of Volga Bulgaria and the vast caliphate stretching far beyond. But Volodymyr hesitated. Though his advisors debated politics and power, he wondered something simpler. Which faith would bind his people together? Which belief could speak to Slavs, Varangians, and Finnic tribes alike? Which god would unify the forests of modern Belarus, the plains of Ukraine, the rivers of Russia, and the shores of the Baltic states? For now, the pagan idols still watched from Kyiv's hills. Sacred fires burned, shamans chanted, and offerings were made. But beyond the wooden walls of his palace, the old world was fading. Volodymyr stood at the edge of history. The time for choosing had not yet come. But the winds of change were blowing stronger each day. The year was 986 AD. Kyivan Rus, stretching across modern Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and parts of Lithuania, stood at a crossroads. The realm was vast, wealthy, and feared by its neighbors. Yet its unity was fragile. Dozens of tribes lived under Volodymyr's rule, each with its own gods, customs, and rituals. The young prince, once a devoted pagan, now faced a choice that would decide the spiritual destiny of his people. And so, he chose a path of knowledge before faith. He summoned his boyars and advisors to the wooden halls of his palace in Kyiv, the same hills where today rises the Saint Sophia Cathedral, and declared his intention. If the gods of the old ways cannot unite us, then we must seek the faith that can. Volodymyr sent envoys to the four great centers of faith that touched Kyivan Rus: Islamic Volga Bulgaria, now part of modern Tatarstan, Russia; Byzantium, the mighty empire whose capital lies in modern Istanbul, Turkey; Rome, represented by priests from the lands of modern Germany and Poland; Khazaria, where Jewish traditions and scholarship thrived, near what is now southern Russia. Each mission was dangerous. These journeys stretched across rivers, forests, and mountains, through lands where cultures clashed and armies marched. But Volodymyr knew that understanding these faiths was the only way to decide the future of his realm. The first envoys traveled east to the land of the Volga Bulgars, modern Tatarstan, Russia, where Islam had taken root centuries before. They followed the great rivers, Volga and Kama, sailing past endless forests and grasslands. There, they witnessed mosques of carved stone, merchants dressed in silk, and streets filled with the hum of prayers. But when they returned, they told Volodymyr something troubling. "There is no joy among them, my prince. The laws are strict, and they forbid wine, songs, and laughter." For Volodymyr, who loved feasts, music, and wine, this was a difficult obstacle. Though he respected the discipline and unity of Islam, he hesitated to bring such restrictions upon his people. Next, envoys were sent west, to lands influenced by the Pope of Rome, crossing territories of modern Poland and Germany. In the cathedrals they visited, they saw the splendor of Latin Christianity: tall stone churches, golden chalices, and priests in white and crimson robes. Yet when they returned, their report was cautious. "The ceremonies are beautiful, my prince, but we found their lands colder to strangers, and their power divided among many kings. Kyivan Rus sought not only a faith but also an ally strong enough to secure its future. The West offered riches and knowledge, but lacked the imperial power Volodymyr desired. Other envoys traveled south to the remnants of the Khazar Khaganate near the Caspian Sea, in the lands of modern southern Russia. There they studied Judaism, its sacred scrolls, and the traditions of a people who had survived centuries without a homeland. They returned with reverence but also concern. Their faith is deep and ancient, but they are scattered and without a kingdom, and their power is not what it once was. Volodymyr respected their traditions but sought a faith that could strengthen his realm, not isolate it. Finally, Volodymyr sent envoys to Constantinople, today's Istanbul, Turkey, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. There, in the grand cathedral of Hagia Sophia, they witnessed something beyond words. Golden mosaics glittered beneath sunlight streaming through vast domes. Priests in flowing blue and gold robes chanted hymns that echoed like celestial choirs. When they returned, they could hardly contain their awe. "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. Such beauty we have never seen. Surely, God dwells there among men." These words shook Volodymyr. The envoys had seen many lands, but only Byzantium left them breathless. The reports left the prince restless. In the candlelit halls of his palace, he paced beneath carved beams while the pagan idols watched silently from their places. He weighed his options. Islam promised unity but demanded sacrifice. Rome offered prestige but lacked power. Judaism was noble but isolated. Byzantium shone brightest, blending majesty with strength. Kyivan Rus sat between east and west, between north and south. The wrong choice could divide his realm forever. The right choice could transform it into one of the greatest powers of medieval Europe. By the end of 986 AD, Volodymyr had not yet chosen his path. The sacred fires of Perun still burned on Kyiv's hills, their smoke rising into the winter sky. Shamans whispered chants beneath the stars, and merchants still brought offerings to wooden idols. But now, new voices filled Kyiv streets. Greek missionaries reading scripture, Latin priests debating philosophy, Islamic traders sharing knowledge from distant Baghdad. Volodymyr knew his decision could not wait forever. A single choice would decide the future of the lands that today we call Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Lithuania. The faith of a realm and its destiny rested in his hands. The year was 987 AD. Across the hills of Kyiv, sacred fires still burned before wooden idols, but the winds of change were sweeping through Kyivan Rus. The pagan gods, Perun, Veles, Mokosh, still stood tall, yet their silent wooden faces seemed to watch as new faiths crept closer to the land. Prince Volodymyr the Great sat in his wooden palace overlooking the Dnipro River, in what is today Kyiv, Ukraine. The reports from his envoys echoed in his mind. Tales of Byzantium's splendor, Rome's rituals, Islam's discipline, and the wisdom of Judaism. But one image refused to leave him. The golden light of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, described by his envoys as heaven on earth. Far to the south, the Byzantine Empire, centered in modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, faced a dire crisis. Two imperial brothers, Basil II and Constantine VIII, sat upon a fragile throne, threatened by internal rebellions and outside invaders. The empire needed warriors, and Kyivan Rus had them. When envoys from Byzantium arrived in Kyiv, they came not as missionaries but as allies in need. They offered Volodymyr a proposal. If he sent his Varangian warriors to support Basil II, and if he embraced Christianity under the Eastern Orthodox Rite, then Byzantium would grant him political alliance, and something even more precious, the hand of Princess Anna, sister of the emperors. A marriage into the Byzantine imperial family was unheard of. No pagan ruler had ever been offered such an honor. For Byzantium, this was a desperate gamble. For Volodymyr, it was an opportunity to elevate Kyivan Rus onto the world stage. For days, Volodymyr withdrew into his hall. He walked among flickering torches, beneath carved beams heavy with smoke and history. The idols of Perun and Veles still stood nearby, their wooden faces unchanging, their silence deafening. The boyars debated fiercely. Some warned against abandoning the old gods, fearing anger from the pagan tribes. Others saw alliance with Byzantium as a way to secure wealth, influence, and recognition. Volodymyr listened, but deep inside he already knew where his heart leaned. The reports of Hagia Sophia, the unity of Byzantium's faith, and the promise of imperial blood had already planted their seed. In 988 AD, Volodymyr made his move. To prove his strength to Byzantium, he launched a campaign against the city of Chersonesus, a Byzantine stronghold in Crimea, modern Ukraine. The siege lasted months. His warriors built siege engines, cut supply lines, and surrounded the city by land and sea. Chersonesus fell. Volodymyr now held a valuable bargaining chip in his hands, and Byzantium could no longer ignore his power. After negotiations, Volodymyr agreed to embrace Christianity. According to chronicles, he was baptized in Chersonesus, on the same shores where his warriors had camped only months before. The ceremony was solemn, lit by candlelight and hymns. Volodymyr emerged from the waters reborn, taking a new path for himself and his realm. In the same year, he married Princess Anna, tying Kyivan Rus to one of the most powerful empires of the medieval world. The union marked a political triumph and a spiritual turning point. When Volodymyr returned to Kyiv in 988 AD, the city stood on the brink of transformation. He ordered the pagan idols of Perun and Veles to be cast down from the hilltop where they had stood for generations. The statue of Perun, chroniclers say, was dragged to the Dnipro River and thrown into the water, while priests and villagers wept on the riverbank. Volodymyr then called upon the people of Kyiv to gather at the river's edge, near where the Poshtova Square lies today in modern Ukraine. There, thousands of men, women, and children entered the waters of the Dnipro together, baptizing not just individuals but an entire nation. The chants of pagan priests gave way to Christian hymns. The fires of sacrifice were replaced by the ringing of church bells. Kyivan Rus was no longer the same. Byzantium sent priests, architects, and builders to Kyiv. Stone churches replaced wooden shrines. Schools and scriptoria opened, teaching literacy in Old Church Slavonic. Art, law, and diplomacy began to transform under the influence of Byzantine traditions. Kyivan Rus entered a new age, one tied not only to the Dnipro but also to Constantinople, Rome, and the Christian world beyond. The decision that Volodymyr made on the shores of Chersonesus would echo for centuries, shaping the identities of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Eastern Europe itself. By aligning Kyivan Rus with Byzantium, Volodymyr gained international recognition and spiritual authority. He transformed a realm of tribes and wooden fortresses into a centralized Christian state at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. But the choice was not without cost. Many resisted conversion, clinging to the old gods of their ancestors. In the forests of modern Belarus and the northern lands of Russia, pagan shrines still burned secretly for generations. Still, the foundations had been laid. The golden domes of Kyiv would soon rise, and with them, a new identity for the land and its people. The year was 988 AD. The high hills of Kyiv, today the capital of Ukraine, overlooked the winding Dnipro River. Morning mist rose from the waters as thousands of villagers gathered on the riverbanks. They came from wooden huts and market squares, leaving behind their fields and hearths. Some came willingly, others reluctantly, driven by duty or fear. That day, the city stood at a turning point between two worlds. Behind them, on the hills, wooden statues of Perun, Veles, Mokosh, and Dazbog stood silent, their carved faces glowing in the soft light of dawn. Before them stretched the river, calm and cold, ready to wash away the past. Prince Volodymyr the Great stood upon a wooden platform overlooking the crowd. He wore a simple white linen robe, a symbol of renewal, and held a golden cross brought from Byzantium. Behind him stood Byzantine priests, clad in blue and gold robes, chanting softly in Greek. The sound of their hymns mixed with the murmurs of the people and the gentle rush of the Dnipro. Volodymyr's voice rose above the crowd. "Come forth, all people of Kyiv, and let us enter the waters of life. Those who desire to be sons and daughters of the true God, follow me into the Dnipro." Some cheered. Some crossed themselves nervously. Others clutched small wooden idols hidden in their hands. not all came willingly. In the forests of modern Belarus and the northern regions of Russia, pagan priests whispered warnings. If you abandon Perun, the storms will return. Without Veles, the cattle will die. Mokosh will turn away from our fields. Some clans resisted openly, but Volodymyr had prepared well. He knew unity was impossible without a shared faith, and he brought his Varangian guards, Norse warriors from modern Sweden, to ensure peace on this day. No swords were drawn, but the silent presence of steel was enough. One by one, the people stepped into the river. Men, women, children, elders, thousands filled the shallow waters of the Dnipro near today's Poshtova Square in Kyiv. Priests waded among them, pouring water over bowed heads, whispering prayers in Old Church Slavonic. The river shimmered beneath the sun, carrying away fragments of the old world. The cries of infants mixed with hymns. Splashes of water echoed beneath the hills. Above, the wooden statues of the pagan gods stood motionless, watching as their dominion faded into memory. Historical chronicles describe the scene. People knelt in the river as sunlight reflected off the water. Byzantine priests sang chants brought from Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Volodymyr himself walked among his people, blessing each group, touching the waters that now held a new meaning. After the baptism, Volodymyr gave his most controversial order. The wooden idol of Perun, chief god of thunder and war, was to be cast down. Crowds gathered on the hilltop, near where the St. Andrew's Church stands today. Ropes were tied around the statue's neck, and with a heavy pull, Perun toppled. Cries rose from the crowd as the idol was dragged down the hill and thrown into the river. Chronicles say that Volodymyr commanded, "If he is a god, let him swim." The current carried Perun's figure past the crowds, and people wept as the waves took him away. It was not just the end of a statue, it was the end of an age. In the months that followed, new Byzantine architects arrived in Kyiv. They began building stone churches, replacing wooden shrines with rising domes and marble altars. Schools were founded to teach reading and writing in Old Church Slavonic, bringing literacy to the lands of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople became the model for future churches, influencing art and architecture across Eastern Europe. Icons painted in deep blues and golds filled the walls of the first Christian sanctuaries. Markets along the Dnipro shifted too. Merchants brought sacred scrolls, incense, and painted icons alongside silks and spices. Kyiv became not just a center of trade but a spiritual capital, linking the north to Byzantium and beyond. Not everyone accepted the change. In the forests of modern Smolensk, Russia, and the northern lands near Novgorod, pagan practices survived in secret. Villagers still left offerings to the old gods at night, far from the watchful eyes of priests. Generations would pass before Christianity reached every corner of Kyivan Rus. Yet, within Kyiv itself, the transformation was rapid and profound. A city of wooden idols became a city of stone churches, and the sound of drums gave way to the ringing of bells. By the end of 989 AD, Kyivan Rus stood changed forever. The choice of Volodymyr had forged a new cultural and spiritual foundation. The lands of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were no longer merely connected by trade and blood. They were now bound by faith. Kyiv became known across Europe and the Near East as a Christian stronghold, a rising power at the crossroads of East and West. From Constantinople to Rome, from Baghdad to the Baltic, the name of Volodymyr spread. His decision set the course for centuries of history. The golden domes that would soon crown Kyiv's skyline were more than symbols of faith. They were symbols of a new destiny. The year was 990 AD. Only 2 years had passed since the baptism of Kyivan Rus. Yet the transformation was already unmistakable. From the wooden hills of Kyiv, today the capital of Ukraine, the sound of ringing bells now carried over the Dnipro River, replacing the chants once sung to Perun and Veles. Kyiv had begun its journey from a city of wooden idols to a city of golden domes. After Volodymyr's conversion, Byzantium sent not just priests but also architects, scholars, painters, and builders. From Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey, came the skills and traditions of a 1,000-year empire. The first churches were raised where pagan shrines once stood. Wooden sanctuaries were replaced with stone basilicas modeled after Byzantine designs. Among them was the Church of the Tithes, Desiatina Church, built near the Palace of Volodymyr in Kyiv. Its walls were covered with frescoes, its altar adorned with icons of gold and lapis lazuli, and its ceilings glimmered with Byzantine mosaics. To the people of Kyivan Rus, this was unlike anything they had seen before. For generations, their sacred places had been forests, rivers, and wooden groves. Now faith was entering stone and light. With Christianity came literacy. Byzantine priests brought books written in Greek and taught the newly developed Glagolitic script, later evolving into the Cyrillic alphabet. This allowed the people of Kyivan Rus to read scripture, write laws, and record chronicles for the first time. Schools were founded in Kyiv, Novgorod, modern Russia, and Chernihiv, modern Ukraine. Children of boyars and merchants studied theology, philosophy, history, and diplomacy. Knowledge flowed north along the Dnipro, reaching the forests of modern Belarus and the Baltic shores of Latvia and Lithuania. Kyivan Rus was no longer just a land of warriors and traders. It was becoming a center of culture, education, and law. Before Volodymyr's conversion, justice in Kyivan Rus had been tribal, guided by customs, vengeance, and local traditions. But with Christianity came a new legal framework inspired by Byzantine law. Volodymyr introduced a system where fines replaced blood feuds, and written decrees replaced oral traditions. The first steps toward the Ruskaya Pravda, the code of law compiled later under Yaroslav the Wise, began during this time. This shift helped unify the lands of modern Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus under common legal principles rather than tribal customs. With its conversion, Kyiv became more than just a trading hub. It became a spiritual center of Eastern Europe. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to witness the city's growing beauty. Merchants brought incense from Syria, icons from Constantinople, and manuscripts from Athens. Kyiv's role changed internationally as well. Relations with Byzantium deepened, giving Kyivan Rus access to imperial alliances and cultural exchange. Ties with Rome grew more cautious but respectful, as Kyiv's new Christian identity earned recognition in Western Europe. Along the northern rivers, trade with Scandinavia expanded, blending Varangian traditions with Christian customs. Kyiv became a crossroads of empires, a meeting place of faiths, languages, and ideas. The influence of Byzantine art was profound. Churches were filled with icons painted on wood, depicting saints, angels, and Christ in deep blues and golds. Mosaic floors sparkled beneath candlelight, creating reflections that seemed to dance like stars on water. Choral singing replaced pagan chants. Byzantine hymnals introduced polyphonic styles, and soon, music from Kyiv spread throughout the lands of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Through architecture, painting, and song, a new identity was being born, one rooted in both local traditions and Byzantine grandeur. Not all embraced the transformation. In the northern forests near Novgorod and the remote regions of modern Russia and Belarus, pagan rituals survived in secret. Villagers still left offerings to the old gods at night. Priests of Mokosh and Veles held clandestine ceremonies far from the Christian cities. Yet Volodymyr understood that force alone would not unite his realm. He allowed a slow transition, combining old festivals with new Christian celebrations, blending traditions to ease the transformation. By the end of the 10th century, Kyivan Rus had changed beyond recognition. Pagan wooden sanctuaries gave way to Byzantine stone churches. Oral legends became written chronicles. Local customs evolved into codified law. Kyiv transformed into a center of trade, education, and faith. The decisions made during these years shaped the future of Eastern Europe for centuries. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the forests of Belarus to the steppes of southern Ukraine, Volodymyr's influence united diverse peoples into a single cultural sphere. Kyiv was no longer just a city. It was becoming a symbol of power, faith, and civilization. The year was 995 AD. Just a few years had passed since the baptism of Kyivan Rus, and yet its place in the world had transformed. From the high hills of Kyiv, The golden domes of new stone churches glittered beneath the sun. Along the wide Dnipro River, merchants from distant lands filled the markets with silks, spices, manuscripts, and silver. The city had become not just the spiritual heart of the region, but also a center of international trade and diplomacy. Kyiv now stood between worlds, between Byzantium and Rome, between the Islamic East and the Norse North, between the Baltic and the Black Sea. Its position made it powerful but also vulnerable. The baptism of Volodymyr and his marriage to Princess Anna, sister of Byzantine emperors Basil II and Constantine VIII, forged a powerful bond between Kyivan Rus and Byzantium. From Constantinople, modern Istanbul, Turkey, came not only priests and scholars but also political recognition. Byzantine envoys now sat in Volodymyr's court in Kyiv, advising on matters of law, architecture, and military strategy. In return, Rus provided Varangian warriors, Norse mercenaries from modern Sweden and Norway, who fought alongside Byzantine armies against rebels in Anatolia and enemies along the eastern Mediterranean. The alliance strengthened both powers. Byzantium gained warriors. Kyivan Rus gained status. Across Europe and the Near East, rulers began to treat Kyiv as an equal, not a frontier. Kyiv's power was rooted in its location. The Dnipro River formed the spine of the legendary trade route known as from the Varangians to the Greeks, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Merchants traveled from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark down through modern Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, reaching Byzantium and beyond. Kyiv's markets were alive with diversity. Greek merchants offered silk, wine, and icons from Constantinople. Arab traders brought spices, silver, and perfumes from Baghdad and Damascus. Jewish merchants carried manuscripts and rare dyes from the lands of modern Israel. Scandinavian Varangians traded amber, weapons, and furs from the northern forests. Standing on Kyiv's hills today, you can still trace this history. The river that once carried Byzantine ships and Viking longboats still winds below the city, a reminder of the crossroads where empires met. While Byzantium influenced the south, the north remained tied to the Varangians, Norse traders and warriors from modern Sweden and Norway. Many had settled in Novgorod and Pskov, now part of Russia, blending Norse traditions with Slavic culture. The Varangians brought with them not just goods but ideas. Shipbuilding techniques that made Dnipro fleets faster and stronger. Warrior traditions that shaped the elite guard of Volodymyr. New trade networks stretching into the Baltic states and beyond. Kyivan Rus became a bridge between Scandinavian trade and Byzantine luxury, connecting two very different worlds. To the west, Kyivan Rus developed new ties with the lands of modern Poland, Germany, and Hungary. Volodymyr forged alliances with Western Christian rulers, exchanging envoys and gifts. Though Kyivan Rus embraced Eastern Orthodoxy, it remained open to dialogue with Rome and Latin Europe. This dual position, aligned with Byzantium yet respected by the West, gave Kyiv a unique diplomatic advantage. It could negotiate trade, secure military aid, and influence events across the continent. But prosperity brought danger. South of Kyiv, the open grasslands, today part of southern Ukraine, were home to nomadic tribes who raided river settlements and caravans. Among them were the Pecheneg, fierce steppe warriors who struck swiftly and vanished just as quickly. Volodymyr built fortified outposts along the southern frontier, near modern Zaporizhia and Kherson. Wooden walls rose around key towns, watchtowers overlooked the steppes, and garrisons of warriors protected trade routes. Even so, the steppe remained unpredictable. Every merchant's journey from the Baltic to Byzantium carried risk, yet the rewards were too great to abandon. By the end of the 10th century, Kyiv had become a city of languages, religions, and traditions. In its markets and streets, one could hear Old Church Slavonic, Greek, Norse, Arabic, and Latin. Icons from Constantinople hung beside Scandinavian carvings. Slavic bards sang alongside Byzantine choirs. This cultural exchange shaped the identity of Kyivan Rus. Byzantine art inspired frescoes and mosaics. Norse craftsmanship influenced weapons and jewelry. Islamic science and medicine traveled north along trade routes. Western Christianity introduced new legal and philosophical ideas. Kyiv became more than a capital. It was a meeting point of civilizations. Through Volodymyr's diplomacy, Kyivan Rus transformed from a land of fragmented tribes into an acknowledged power among empires. It was no longer a frontier between worlds, it was the world between worlds. From Constantinople to Baghdad, from Stockholm to Rome, Kyiv's name carried weight. Foreign rulers sent envoys to its halls. Merchants planned their journeys around its markets. Priests and scholars traveled north to teach in its schools and scriptoria. Standing at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, Kyivan Rus had become a gateway between empires, a realm where old traditions met new faiths, where wooden fortresses grew into stone cities, and where the decisions of one prince reshaped an entire region. By the dawn of the 11th century, Kyivan Rus stood as one of the most influential realms in Eastern Europe. The golden domes of Kyiv rose above the Dnipro, their brilliance visible from the river below. Stone churches replaced wooden shrines, markets overflowed with silks and silver, and voices from across the known world filled the streets. Yet beneath this splendor lay seeds that, over centuries, would grow into division. What Prince Volodymyr had united under one faith, history would eventually fracture into competing identities. The lands that once formed Kyivan Rus stretched far and wide, encompassing what is now Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and parts of the Baltic states. In those days, there was no question of borders or modern nations. Kyiv was the center, the beating heart of a realm bound together by rivers and roads, by trade and tribute, by a shared sense of belonging. To stand on Kyiv's hills at the turn of the millennium was to look upon a land of diversity and unity all at once. Pagan shrines still survived in distant forests, Christian schools opened in new towns, and the Dnipro carried merchants, priests, and soldiers between worlds. But as generations passed, the threads that bound Kyivan Rus together began to loosen. The grandsons and great-grandsons of Volodymyr inherited not one realm, but many ambitions. Rival princes fought for control of Kyiv, Novgorod, Chernihiv, and Polotsk. What had once been a strong and united realm became a mosaic of competing centers of power, each shaping its identity in subtle ways. Kyiv remained the spiritual and cultural heart, but Novgorod in modern Russia began to carve its own path, embracing trade with the north and west. Polotsk in modern Belarus became a hub of learning and religion, nurturing traditions that would shape Belarusian culture centuries later. Even as Kyivan Rus fragmented politically, its shared cultural heritage endured. The Cyrillic alphabet, adopted from the work of Byzantine scholars, spread through the forests and river valleys, uniting distant tribes through language and scripture. The Orthodox faith became the spiritual backbone of the region, influencing art, music, and law. Yet in that unity lay the roots of future claims, as different lands began to see themselves not merely as heirs of Kyivan Rus, but as its rightful successors. In Kyiv, chronicles were written, preserving the memory of Volodymyr and his baptism of the realm. To the people living along the Dnipro, the lands of modern Ukraine, Kyiv was the origin of their faith, their writing, their identity. But far to the northeast, in the forests surrounding modern Moscow, new powers were rising. Over time, the city-states of the northeast would gather strength under different rulers, adapting the traditions of Kyivan Rus while developing their own political and cultural identity. These regions would one day become the heart of Russia, and with that growth came a competing narrative that Moscow, too, was the true heir of Kyivan Rus. Meanwhile, the lands of Belarus followed a different path. Polotsk, Vitebsk, and other centers became deeply connected to both Kyiv and the Baltic regions, forming cultural bridges between Slavic, Baltic, and later Polish traditions. While Kyiv looked south toward Byzantium and Moscow gazed east toward the steppes, the lands of Belarus stood at a crossroads, shaped by overlapping influences and loyalties. Over the centuries, the memory of Kyivan Rus became both a shared heritage and a contested story. For Ukraine, it represented the birth of their nation and the foundation of their capital, Kyiv. For Russia, it became the symbolic origin of its Orthodox identity and imperial ambitions. For Belarus, it embodied ancient connections that tied their lands to both east and west. Each modern nation looked back upon the same history but saw different reflections of itself within it. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, striking from the steppes into the cities of Kyivan Rus, shattered what remained of political unity. Kyiv, once a thriving metropolis, fell into decline. Power shifted northward to Novgorod, and later to Moscow, which slowly rose as a center of influence. Yet even as Kyiv's political role waned, its spiritual and cultural legacy endured, preserved in chronicles, churches, and memory. To stand in Kyiv today, near the golden domes of St. Sophia, is to see a city that has never forgotten its origins, even as others have sought to claim them. By the dawn of the modern era, Kyiv's story had become entangled with larger powers. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and later the Russian Empire all sought to shape the narrative of Kyivan Rus to legitimize their claims. Borders shifted, identities evolved, and yet the memory of a unified Rus remained a constant thread in every version of the story. Today, historians trace these competing narratives back to this shared origin. The question of who owns the legacy of Kyivan Rus still echoes in political debates, cultural dialogues, and even conflicts. To some, Kyiv is the heart of an independent Ukrainian identity, the birthplace of Slavic Christianity and written culture. To others, it is inseparable from a broader Russian past, part of an enduring continuum of history. And in Belarus, the legacy carries yet another meaning, emphasizing their role as a bridge between northern, southern, and western traditions. Standing on the hills above the Dnipro, watching the river carve its path through the city as it has for over 1,000 years, one can still feel the weight of this shared past. The waters that carried Volodymyr's warriors, Byzantine missionaries, and Varangian traders now carry memories. The streets below, filled with people speaking Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian, are reminders that history is neither simple nor singular. The story of Kyivan Rus does not belong to any one nation alone. It belongs to the rivers, the forests, the people, and the faiths that shaped it. It belongs to Kyiv, but it also lives in Moscow, in Polotsk, in Novgorod, in Vilnius. It lives wherever the echoes of its culture, faith, and language still resonate. The golden domes of Kyiv shine today as they once did 1,000 years ago, reflecting sunlight into the waters of the Dnipro. But where once they symbolized unity, now they illuminate the complexity of a shared yet divided past. A history that continues to shape the destinies of nations born from the same ancient realm. The year was 1015 AD. Prince Volodymyr the Great, once the pagan ruler who cast down the idols of Perun and raised the golden cross above Kyiv, breathed his last in his wooden palace on the hills overlooking the Dnipro River. Outside, the bells of stone churches rang softly, their echoes drifting over the waters where, years before, thousands had stepped into the river to be baptized. The city he had transformed now shone with a new identity, carrying the weight of a decision that would echo for centuries. In his lifetime, Volodymyr had been called many names: a conqueror, a reformer, a unifier, a saint. Yet his greatest legacy was not in battles won or fortresses built, but in the faith he chose for his people. The baptism of Kyivan Rus in 988 AD reshaped the destiny of a vast realm, bringing it into the spiritual and cultural orbit of Byzantium and the wider Christian world. After his death, his successors carried forward his vision, but each in their own way. His son Yaroslav the Wise would expand upon his father's work, codifying laws, founding schools, and building the magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral, which still crowns the skyline of modern Kyiv, Ukraine. Under Yaroslav, Kyiv became known as the Mother of Rus cities, a center of faith and diplomacy stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. But Volodymyr's legacy extended beyond Kyiv's walls. Through rivers and trade routes, through chronicles and church liturgies, his decision touched lands that today form Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and the Baltic states. From Novgorod's forests in modern Russia to the markets of Polotsk in Belarus, the influence of his choice unified peoples under a shared written language, faith, and cultural identity. For centuries, the sound of church bells echoed through the same valleys and forests where pagan chants once carried in the night. And yet, this unity was fragile, held together by faith but tested by ambition. Over time, princes fought among themselves, carving Kyivan Rus into competing centers. Kyiv, Novgorod, Polotsk, Vladimir Suzdal, Chernihiv. What had been one realm became many, and the memory of Volodymyr's choice became a prize to be claimed. When the Mongols swept across the steppes in the 13th century, the political center of Rus shifted north, first to Novgorod and later to Moscow. Yet Kyiv remained the spiritual heart, where chronicles were written and traditions preserved. To this day, the golden domes of St. Sophia reflect sunlight into the same river that bore witness to baptism more than a millennium ago. In modern times, Volodymyr's legacy continues to shape identity and memory. For Ukraine, he is celebrated as the father of their Christian tradition, the ruler who brought literacy, art, and learning to the land. In Russia, he is venerated as the founder of Orthodoxy, the spiritual ancestor of Moscow's rise to power. In Belarus, he symbolizes ancient connections to Kyiv and shared Slavic heritage. Across these lands, statues of Volodymyr stand in city squares, his image etched into icons, coins, and cathedrals. Yet his memory also carries tension. Competing narratives arise from a single history, each claiming to inherit the mantle of Kyivan Rus. To some, Kyiv is the rightful center of this legacy. To others, Moscow continues the story begun on the Dnipro. And still, the river flows, silent, patient, eternal, as nations debate ownership of a shared past. What cannot be disputed, however, is the transformation Volodymyr set into motion. His embrace of Christianity connected Kyivan Rus to the wider world, shaping its art, law, architecture, and language. Placed Kyiv on the maps of Byzantium, Rome, and beyond. It forged a bridge between the forests of the north and the Mediterranean south, between Scandinavia and the steppes, between the old pagan gods and a new Christian identity. 1,000 years later, to stand upon Kyiv's high hills and look down at the Dnipro is to see layers of time woven together. The river reflects the golden domes of St. Sophia, but beneath its surface lies the memory of wooden idols dragged from their altars. The same waters that carried Byzantine missionaries, Varangian traders, and Slavic villagers now carry the echoes of history itself. Volodymyr's legacy is written not only in chronicles but also in stone, in music, in the rhythms of language, and in the prayers whispered in cathedrals. It lives in Kyiv's streets, in Novgorod's archives, in Polotsk's monasteries, and in Moscow's bells. It is both shared and divided, ancient and eternal, celebrated and contested. And so, as the sun sets over the hills of Kyiv and its domes burn gold in the fading light, the story continues. The decisions of one prince, made more than a millennium ago, still shape the identities of nations and the destinies of millions. The baptism of Kyivan Rus was more than a turning point in history. It was the birth of a civilization whose influence still resonates today. More than 1,000 years have passed since the morning when the waters of the Dnipro River reflected the chanting of Byzantine priests and the voices of thousands entering its currents. The idols of Perun, Veles, and Mokosh are long gone, their wooden forms lost to time and riverbeds, yet their shadows still linger in memory. The golden domes of Kyiv now rise where wooden shrines once stood, and the bells of St. Sophia Cathedral echo softly over a modern city. But beneath the hum of traffic and the sound of people walking cobbled streets, the story of Volodymyr the Great still whispers, shaping the identities of nations, beliefs, and borders. To stand today on Kyiv's high hills and look across the Dnipro is to see layers of time woven into one landscape. Below, the river glimmers under sunlight, as it has for centuries, carrying history from the forests of Belarus to the steppes of southern Ukraine, from the Baltic shores of Lithuania to the Black Sea. Across these lands, the memory of Kyivan Rus binds cities, people, and faiths together. And yet, paradoxically, it also divides them. In modern Ukraine, Volodymyr is celebrated as a founding figure, a ruler who shaped Kyiv into the cultural and spiritual heart of Eastern Europe. His decision to embrace Christianity is seen not only as a religious act but as the beginning of an independent identity, connecting Kyiv with Byzantium, with Europe, and with the wider world. Statues of Volodymyr stand tall in the capital, and the anniversary of the Baptism of Rus is marked with ceremonies, processions, and prayers along the Dnipro's banks, near the very spot where thousands were baptized in 988 AD. In Russia, Volodymyr is also revered, but through a different lens. Moscow claims continuity with Kyivan Rus, seeing itself as the successor of Orthodoxy and the guardian of the faith Volodymyr brought to the region. The city's cathedrals reflect the architectural traditions born in Kyiv, and Russian chronicles preserve the same stories of wooden idols, golden domes, and the mass baptism. Yet for Moscow, Volodymyr's legacy supports a narrative of unity under one history, one culture, and one church, a vision that sometimes clashes with Ukraine's own view of independence and identity. In Belarus, the memory of Kyivan Rus carries a quieter weight. The forests of Polotsk and Vitebsk, where the first chronicles were copied and monasteries built, still echo with the same prayers introduced more than a millennium ago. Belarusian traditions hold Volodymyr as part of their shared origin, yet the country's history developed at the crossroads between Kyiv, Lithuania, and Poland, blending influences from east and west into something unique. And yet, for all the differences in how his story is told, Volodymyr's baptism of Kyivan Rus remains one of the few threads connecting these lands through faith, language, and memory. The same Cyrillic alphabet born from Byzantine scholars shapes Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian scripts today. The same Orthodox hymns resonate in cathedrals across these countries. The same Dnipro River still winds past Kyiv's golden domes, carrying the past forward into the present. But history is rarely peaceful. The shared memory of Kyivan Rus has become a field of competing narratives. Who owns the legacy? Who can claim Kyiv's heritage as their own? Ukraine points to the baptismal waters of the Dnipro and the chronicles written in Kyiv as proof that the story begins and continues there. Russia emphasizes its rise after the Mongol invasions, claiming to preserve what Kyiv could not. Belarus sees itself as a bridge, holding pieces of both traditions while maintaining its own. Even beyond borders, this legacy shapes diplomacy, religion, and culture. In Constantinople, today's Istanbul, Turkey, the archives of Hagia Sophia still preserve letters exchanged between Volodymyr and Byzantine emperors. In Rome, old papal documents recall the earliest contacts between Kyiv and the Catholic world. Along the Baltic Sea, archaeological sites in Latvia and Lithuania reveal traces of trade, prayer, and Varangian settlements tied to Kyivan Rus. The story is everywhere, woven into the soil, the stones, the languages, and the faiths of Eastern Europe. And yet, for all the disputes and divisions, the essence of Volodymyr's legacy lies not in borders or power but in connection. 1,000 years ago, his decision linked the lands of modern Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and the Baltic states into a shared spiritual and cultural space. It placed Kyiv on the map of empires, drew missionaries and merchants to its markets, and tied the northern forests to the Mediterranean seas. It gave the people of the Dnipro basin a place within a larger world, and gave the world a reason to look toward Kyiv. To walk through Kyiv today is to walk through centuries at once. The ancient cobblestones near St. Sophia Cathedral are worn by pilgrims, invaders, scholars, and poets alike. In the narrow streets, the smell of incense from Orthodox churches mingles with the hum of modern cafes. Markets sell icons beside smartphones, manuscripts beside machines. And above it all, the domes still gleam, as they did when Volodymyr first cast down the idols and raised the cross. History breathes here. It whispers in the language of prayers still sung in Old Church Slavonic. It lingers in the mosaic walls of cathedrals modeled after Byzantium's great basilicas. It drifts with the river's mist over the same banks where thousands once stood together, waiting to enter the waters of the Dnipro. 1,000 years later, the baptism of Kyivan Rus is more than a story in chronicles. It is alive in every dome, every church bell, every river crossing. It is alive in debates about identity, sovereignty, and belonging. It is alive in the streets of Kyiv, Moscow, and Polotsk, and in the voices of millions who carry pieces of this shared, contested, and enduring past. To stand on the hills above the Dnipro today is to see not just a city, but the entire weight of a civilization. The river flows endlessly, the golden domes shine as they did in Volodymyr's time, and beneath it all lies a single truth. Kyivan Rus is the beginning of many stories, but it belongs to no one alone. It belongs to the people who carry its memory, to the lands shaped by its faith, and to the generations yet to come.